Saturn defies evolutionary models in several ways. For one thing, its magnetic field doesn't match evolutionary predictions at all. As one article explained, Saturn dumbfounded planetary theorists who study dynamo models by having a highly symmetric internal magnetic field. A field that is symmetric about the rotation axis violates a basic theorem of magnetic dynamos. Saturn's magnetic field doesn't seem to be coming from a dynamo. This would be impossible if Saturn were billions of years old, as evolution says. But there's no problem at all if Saturn is only thousands of years old, as the Bible says. But there's an even bigger problem we need to discuss. A recent study took a closer look at the formation of Saturn and Jupiter. Remember that model of the gas and dust cloud that supposedly formed all the planets? Well, the study discovered that Saturn, and Jupiter as well, wouldn't be here today if that model was true. One report on the study described this model and then said this: "These theories fail to describe the formation of gas giant planets in a satisfactory way. Gravitational interaction between the gaseous protoplanetary disk and the massive planetary cores causes them to move rapidly inward over about 100,000 years in what we call the migration of the planet and the disk. Theories predict that the giant protoplanets will merge into the central star before planets have time to form. This makes it very difficult to understand how they can form at all." Astronomers call this the migration problem. In plain English, Jupiter and Saturn would have both migrated inwards and slammed into the sun billions of years ago if that whole gas and dust story was true. Since we see Jupiter and Saturn today, obviously the gas and dust story isn't true. The report concluded this way: understanding the formation of giant planets is currently one of the major challenges for astronomers. If the evolutionary model says that Jupiter and Saturn shouldn't be there, but they are there instead, I'd say that's more than a major challenge for the model. I'd say it falsifies the model completely, wouldn't you? We see then that Saturn creates huge problems for evolution. But we're not done yet. Saturn also has dozens of moons, some of which are fascinating. Let's look at a couple. This is Enceladus, one of Saturn's moons. Our first close-up pictures of Enceladus were beautiful, but nobody expected what would come next. When we started taking pictures from a different angle, we saw something unusual. This is Enceladus, below Saturn's rings. Do you see the faint smudge below the moon? A closer look reveals that Enceladus has a fountain coming out of its south pole. When the pictures were colorized to bring out invisible details, we saw that this wasn't just a little spray, it's a huge geyser. Evolutionists were, and still are, stunned by this. Evolutionary models can't explain it. The problem is that Enceladus is supposed to be billions of years old. It's supposed to have cooled off from its formation eons ago. It's not supposed to have the energy to do any of this. Also, we recently took a close look at some of the other moons of Saturn. We found out that Enceladus's neighbors are much brighter than they're supposed to be. Apparently, Enceladus is spray painting them with ice and snow. Evolutionary models say that Enceladus is old, cold, and dead, but it looks like it's none of those things. Enceladus is a great piece of evidence for a young solar system. Then there's Titan. Titan is Saturn's largest moon. This is another great example of how over and over again evolutionary theories have failed to explain our solar system. Titan is a very unusual moon. As you can see, it looks fuzzy. That's because it has an atmosphere. Titan's atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, but it has some methane mixed in. That methane has caused all sorts of problems for evolutionary theories. You see, sunlight breaks methane down. Scientists have calculated that the methane in Titan's atmosphere could only last 10 million years or so, far short of the 4.5 billion years that it's supposed to be. However, there's still lots of methane there today. So, if Titan was really billions of years old, it would have two things. Number one, a source of methane to keep replenishing the atmosphere, and number two, a lot of ethane built up on its surface from all the methane that was broken down. Well, a few years ago, the Cassini spacecraft was sent to visit Saturn. It included a special probe to drop onto Titan and investigate this mysterious moon. Because evolutionists believe in billions of years, they confidently predicted we would find a deep global ocean of methane and ethane on Titan. One scientific paper predicted a layer of methane and other chemicals up to 800 meters thick. That's about a half-mile deep. One of the leaders of the Titan project went even further. He said, "This remarkable moon could be covered by a global ocean of ethane with an average depth of up to several kilometers. However, even before the probe arrived, scientists were taking a closer look at Titan from Earth. They started to realize this prediction was wrong. Then, when Cassini's lander finally penetrated the haze, the truth was confirmed. Despite the evolutionists' expectations, there is no global ocean of methane and ethane on Titan. Titan's surface is dry. All we found is some dark areas on the surface, mostly near the North Pole. These look like lake beds, and it appears that at least some of them are lakes of methane and ethane. However, they're still grossly inadequate to fulfill evolution's requirements. As one recent study commented, even if the dark spots were all lakes of methane, the methane on Titan's surface would only be about 1/10 the amount in the atmosphere. This small amount would last only 10 million years at most, not 4,500 million years. And there's another problem too. Since Titan's surface is solid, according to evolution it should have thousands of craters if it was really billions of years old. Remember how I explained about the crater counting idea? As of the time I'm making this video, the crater counters have thoroughly gone over about 10% of Titan's surface. They haven't found thousands of craters. So far they've found 4. Titan doesn't look billions of years old. Titan looks quite young. Titan might be just a moon, but it's a great demonstration of the failure of evolutionary theory. And as we prepare to leave Saturn, I had to tell you about one more thing, actually a pair of things. Here's another wonderful thing from our Creator. You're looking at Janus and Epimetheus, 2 moons of Saturn. You might not think they look very impressive. The thing here isn't how they look, it's what they do. These are now called the dancing moons of Saturn. These 2 moons orbit Saturn in their separate paths, one on the inside and one on the outside. But then, every 4 years, they switch. The one on the outside moves to the inside, and the one on the inside moves to the outside. Isn't that wonderful? It's a silent, graceful ballet going on deep in space. This has to be precisely balanced in order to work. What are the odds of this happening by chance? I think this is a great testimony to our Creator. So now we have to leave this part of our tour. Here's what you aren't being told about Saturn. Saturn, and Jupiter too for that matter, can't have formed according to the nebula theory, from that cloud of gas and dust. Computer simulations show that both planets would have migrated into the Sun billions of years ago. Saturn's magnetic field doesn't match evolutionary theories. Enceladus is young, Titan is young, and Saturn has dancing moons. Saturn tells us that our Creator is not only skilled, but He appreciates beauty. Uranus is the 7th planet out from our Sun. It's so far away that it takes about 84 Earth years to orbit the Sun once. Because it's so far away from us, we didn't know much about Uranus until the Voyager 2 spacecraft visited it in 1986. Voyager discovered that Uranus defies evolutionary predictions in multiple ways. On the left, you see the planet as it appears to the eye. On the right is the planet with false colors added to exaggerate details. The spot you see here is the planet's south pole. Evolutionists had expected Uranus's poles to be on the top and bottom like all the other planets have. Instead, the poles are on the sides. It turns out that Uranus leans way over as it orbits the Sun. All the other planets spin like a top as they go around the Sun, but not Uranus. Uranus rolls along like a ball as it travels through space. Well, this creates a huge problem for evolution. According to the nebula theory, it's impossible for Uranus to have formed this way. Can you guess what the answer is? Yep, that's right. Uranus formed the right way up, as evolution predicts. But then an asteroid crashed into it and knocked it over. This was a really big asteroid, by the way, about the size of the entire Earth. But where's the evidence for this collision? There isn't any. In fact, there's lots of evidence that seems to be inconsistent with the collision. First of all, Uranus is quite stable as it rolls along through space. Its orbit around the Sun is almost perfectly circular. Plus, its orbit lies more closely within the plane of the ecliptic than any other planet besides Earth. Surely a massive collision wouldn't have produced such a perfect orbit. Also, Uranus has moons, over 24 of them in fact, as you see here. Plus, it has a faint ring system. Notice that all these moons are orbiting Uranus's equator. Now remember, the equator is angled up and down instead of sideways like the evolutionists expected. So where did these moons come from? They couldn't have formed before the collision because they wouldn't be orbiting where they are today. And they couldn't have formed after the collision because Uranus was supposedly already formed when the collision occurred. They couldn't even have formed during the collision because their orbits are too regular. They do not look like they were involved in any sort of collision like this. Here's what one scientist said about Uranus's moons. And by the way, this man won the Nobel Prize in Physics. He said, "To place the Uranian satellites in their present, almost coplanar circular orbits would require all the trajectory control sophistication of modern space technology. It is unlikely that any natural phenomenon involving bodies emitted from Uranus could have achieved this result." I think we should recognize that no collision occurred. Uranus was apparently created just the way it is. Uranus causes lots of other problems for evolution too. First of all, Uranus is one of the 4 giant Jovian planets. The other 3 all generate energy. They radiate more energy into space than they receive from the Sun. Uranus is the only giant planet that doesn't do this. But why doesn't it? After all, these planets all supposedly formed at the same time, from the same materials, by the same natural processes. That means they should have turned out roughly the same. But Uranus is very different than the others in this important area. Another problem was discovered when Voyager flew by Uranus and measured the planet's magnetic field. Evolutionists had predicted that Uranus wouldn't have a magnetic field, but it does. Now, creationists weren't surprised when Uranus was found to have a magnetic field. 2 years before the Voyager probe reached Uranus, Dr. Russell Humphreys, who is a Bible-believing physicist, had predicted the planet would have a magnetic field. Since the Bible says the Earth was made of water, Dr. Humphreys said, "What if all the planets were originally created from water? That would have certain implications for their magnetic fields today, 6,000 years later." So he calculated approximately how strong that field would be today. And when Voyager reached Uranus and took measurements, the evolutionists were wrong, and the creation-based prediction was right. There's more we could say about Uranus if we had the time. But before we leave this planet, I have to share with you one of my favorite objects in the solar system, Uranus's moon, Miranda. Miranda is a tiny little moon. It's only about 300 miles across, but it's one of the strangest objects in the solar system. Pity the poor evolutionist who has to explain this thing. The entire moon looks like a patchwork quilt, like it was glued together from a jumble of different pieces. How many different types of terrain can you identify here? There's long strips of rugged terrain, side by side with terrain that's smoother but more heavily cratered. Here's another example. Look at how dramatically the terrain changes from one section to another. It really looks like the moon was assembled from a bunch of separate pieces. Some sections look like someone painted it with a giant paintbrush. Other sections have very dramatic terrain, with canyons several miles deep. Let's look more closely at that cliff on the right. This cliff is about 6 miles high. Imagine standing at the top and looking down. And what's with that big check mark anyway? It's almost as if the creator said, "Ha! Let him try to explain this one." As one evolutionist said, "No one predicted anything looking like Miranda." Another said, "The central problem in modeling the thermal histories of the Uranian satellites is accounting for Miranda." So how do evolutionists explain Miranda? You're probably expecting me to say they explain it with an asteroid collision. Nope, not this time. Miranda is so weird, even the evolutionists admit that an asteroid collision won't help them. Instead, some evolutionists propose 5 collisions. Here's a quote from a NASA website. "Scientists believe that Miranda may have been shattered as many as 5 times during its evolution. After each shattering, the moon would have reassembled from the remains of its former self, with portions of the core exposed and portions of the surface buried." If this sounds like nonsense, it's because it is. Even other evolutionists recognize that this tiny moon wouldn't necessarily survive 1 collision, never mind 5. As one evolutionary astronomer wrote, "Although some sort of collisional disruption appears to be required, it's not obvious that the present terrain, with relief up to 20 kilometers, would survive catastrophic disruption and reassembly." Maybe that's why that NASA website, after telling you about the 5 collisions, says this: Miranda's appearance can be explained by theories, but the real reason is still unknown. So first, they give you a theory, and then admit they actually don't know what happened. In other words, they made up a story and told it to you, even though they know it's not true. Wouldn't it be better just to acknowledge that these objects were created? So here's what you're not being told about Uranus. Evolution says it shouldn't be rotating sideways, but it is. Evolution says it shouldn't have its current magnetic field, but it does. Evolution says it should be radiating energy into space, but it isn't. And Miranda is a complete mystery. Neptune is the 8th planet out from our Sun. It's so far out in the solar system that the light from our Sun takes over 4 hours to reach it. According to evolutionary models, Neptune is old, cold, and dead. It's supposedly billions of years old after all. But unfortunately for evolutionary models, Neptune doesn't look either old, cold, or dead. First of all, Neptune isn't cold. Yes, it's a colder place than Earth, but our space probes have discovered that it's not as cold as evolutionists expected. Instead, the planet radiates into space about twice the energy it receives from the Sun. Neptune isn't dead either. It turns out Neptune is a violent, turbulent place. It has the strongest winds measured anywhere in the solar system. We've measured wind speeds there up to 1,300 miles per hour. This is called the Great Dark Spot. It's a massive storm system roughly the size of Earth, or at least it was. A few years after this photograph was taken by Voyager in 1989, NASA took more pictures of Neptune with the Hubble Space Telescope. The new photographs showed that the dark spot has disappeared. Since then, a new one has been discovered in a different location. Neptune is a dynamic, ever-changing planet. Neptune looks neither cold nor dead. Apparently it's not old either. Neptune also confounds evolutionary theories with its magnetic field. We've seen that over and over again, the magnetic fields in the solar system have falsified evolutionary models. Well, Neptune is no different. We had a hint of the problem already before our first spacecraft even reached Neptune. When Voyager 2 was on its way to Neptune, it visited Uranus first. I already told you that according to evolution, Uranus wasn't supposed to have much of a magnetic field, but it does. There was another surprise, though, that I didn't mention. Not only was Uranus's magnetic field much stronger than the evolutionists expected, it was also tilted and offset from the center of the planet. Evolutionists couldn't make sense of this at all. It doesn't match their models at all. So they scratched their heads and said, well, maybe Voyager flew by just as Uranus's magnetic field was reversing. This would have been very unlikely, although not impossible. But then, 3 years later, Voyager arrived at Neptune, and guess what? Neptune's magnetic field is also tilted and offset from the planet's center. Evolutionists were forced to acknowledge that it seems that the possibility of finding two planets both experiencing magnetic polarity reversals is small. So far, we've seen that Neptune has produced lots of bad news for the evolutionary model. But there's an even bigger problem that I haven't told you about yet. According to evolutionary models, Neptune can't exist at all. Here's how Astronomy magazine explained it. Psst. Astronomers who model the formation of a solar system have kept a dirty little secret. Uranus and Neptune don't exist. Or at least computer simulations have never explained how planets as big as the two gas giants could form so far from the Sun. Bodies orbited so slowly in the outer parts of the Sun's protoplanetary disk that the slow process of gravitational accretion would need more time than the age of the solar system to form bodies with 14.5 and 17.1 times the mass of Earth. Did you catch that? According to evolution, Uranus and Neptune don't exist. Well, last time I checked, both planets were still up there in the sky. Evolutionists are unhappy that their model is such a failure. As one evolutionary astronomer has commented, what is clear is that simple banging together of planetesimals to construct planets takes too long in this remote outer part of the solar system. The time needed exceeds the age of the solar system. We see Uranus and Neptune, but the modest requirement that these planets exist has not been met by this model. Let's ask an important question here. How long has this problem been known? Here's another evolutionist. There have been many attempts to model the evolution of a swarm of colliding planetesimals. Safronov calculated the characteristic timescales for planetary growth. In the terrestrial region, he found timescales of 10 to the 7 years. That's a one with 7 zeros after it. But the time estimates increased rapidly in the outer regions of the solar system and was 10 to the 10 years for Neptune, which is twice the age of the solar system. It is clear that in view of the large timescales found for the formation of the outer planets, A satisfactory theoretical model for the accretion of planets from diffuse material is not available at present. Okay, so this problem was first discovered by a scientist named Safronov. Was this a recent discovery? Nope. Safronov published this in 1972, so evolutionists have known for over 30 years that Uranus and Neptune can't exist, according to their models. Did you hear about this in Time magazine, or in the newspaper, or in a science program? I bet you haven't. In fact, I bet you've been told the opposite. I bet you've been told that evolutionists have the entire solar system figured out, and that they know exactly how it all formed all by itself billions of years ago. Now you know that this is a falsehood. Here's a quote from another evolutionary astronomer. He says this: "It's clear that our level of sophistication of studying planet formation is relatively primitive. So far, it's been very difficult for anybody to come up with a scenario that actually produces Uranus and Neptune." Come up with a scenario. That's a very interesting statement. In fact, it really reveals the heart of the matter. The goal of the evolutionist is to come up with a scenario about how everything got here without a creator being involved. Most evolutionists even seem to believe that just the act of coming up with a story proves it all happened that way. It doesn't even have to be a good story. Just look at what's going on with Uranus and Neptune. Instead of acknowledging their creator, evolutionists would rather cling to a story that denies the very objects it's supposed to explain. Evolutionists need to make up stories about how evolution could have made the planets. How much worse of a story could you come up with than one that says the planets can't exist? Uranus and Neptune prove that it doesn't matter how bad the story is. For the evolutionist, any story is better than acknowledging the truth about their creator. These planets reveal the truth about the creation versus evolution debate. This is not a debate about religion versus science. If it were, there wouldn't be any scientists who believed in creation. But there are hundreds of degreed scientists who do believe in creation. No, this is a debate about the authority of the Bible as God's Word. The Bible explains the scientific data far better than the evolutionary model. Plus, the Bible's truth is supported by evidence from archaeology, geology, history, and many other sources. Not to mention that as the Word of God, the Bible stands on its own authority anyway. But none of that matters to evolutionists. Evolutionists have rejected the Bible because they don't want to be accountable to a creator. They would rather believe a model that says the gas giant planets cannot exist. You can decide for yourself whose model is the better match for the scientific evidence. So here's what you're not being told about Neptune. It looks young, not billions of years old. It generates energy, it's changing constantly, and it has the most violent winds in the entire solar system. Its magnetic field defies evolutionary models. And the biggest problem is this: according to evolution, it can't be there at all. This is the last stop in our tour of the solar system. We're now out even beyond Neptune. You might have expected this last section to focus on Pluto. Well, it won't for several reasons. Number one, we don't know much about Pluto. Our best photographs are only as good as this. This is Pluto and its moon. So that's the first reason. The second is that, as you might have heard, many astronomers no longer consider Pluto to be a planet. We've discovered that there are other similar objects out there in the same neighborhood. One that was recently discovered is even believed to be slightly bigger than Pluto. So Pluto doesn't look so unique anymore, and it's now being recognized as just one among many objects out there beyond Neptune. Since they're beyond Neptune, we call these trans-Neptunian objects, or TNOs for short. TNOs are much farther away from us than anything else in our solar system. If you were standing on one of them, our sun would be so far away, it would appear to be just a bright star. Yet even these tiny chunks of rock and ice, so far away from us, have something to say about creation and evolution. First of all, where did TNOs come from? Supposedly, TNOs are the leftovers from that big cloud of gas and dust that evolutionists believe in. They're asteroids that never formed into planets. That would make them billions of years old, right? Well, evolution runs into problems already, because the more we learn about TNOs, the less they look like they're billions of years old. Scientists have recently discovered that many of the TNOs have fresh ice on them. The material apparently came from volcanic eruptions. But if these little rocks were really billions of years old, they wouldn't be geologically active anymore. They don't have any sources of internal heat, and they certainly don't get much from the sun. The temperatures out there are about 370 degrees below zero. So if they really were billions of years old, they would have frozen solid eons ago. They wouldn't have any volcanoes left anymore. But apparently they do have volcanoes. Apparently, they're not billions of years old after all. But that's not the only evidence for a young creation that TNOs and other objects give us. Let's talk about a group of objects that are among the most spectacular in all the universe. Comets. When a large comet appears in the sky, it can be a breathtaking sight. But what are these objects? Comets are usually described as big, dirty snowballs flying through space. During most of its orbit, a comet doesn't look very exciting. But when it gets close enough to the sun, it heats up, and the ices begin to sublimate into gas. The gas streams out beyond the comet as it flies through space, forming the beautiful tail that we see from Earth. But there's more here than just beauty. A comet burns up and loses material each time it passes by the sun. It gets smaller and smaller each time. Eventually, it will be so small that it will break up into fragments. We've actually seen this process happen with several dozen comets now. Comets can also be destroyed by crashing into the sun or a planet. For example, we saw the Shoemaker-Levy comet break up and hit Jupiter a few years ago. The marks you see here on Jupiter were caused by the comet's fragments smashing into the planet. Comets can even be thrown out of the solar system completely, thanks to gravitational interaction with other objects. So when you see a comet, remember that it's beautiful, but it's also temporary. This has caused a real challenge for evolutionary models. We see lots of comets today, but they can't have been there for billions of years. Comets can't last that long. Evolutionists are stuck here. Their models say that new comets haven't been formed since the early history of the solar system, billions of years ago. At the same time, they need a supply of new comets to replace the ones that are constantly being destroyed. To solve this problem, they believe that there are billions of comets, or comet nuclei as they're called, that are left over from the formation of the solar system. These nuclei orbit the sun at vast distances away. They've never been heated up by the sun at all. They've stayed cold and frozen for billions of years. It's only once in a while that something will happen, a star passing by our solar system, for example. The star disturbs one or more of the comet nuclei and nudges them into orbits closer to the sun. At that point, they turn into normal comets with shortened lifespans. So where are all these nuclei? Evolutionists believe that they're in two different places, the Oort cloud and the Kuiper belt. Evolutionary models need both of these sources to explain comets, and recent discoveries have disproved both of them. We'll start with the so-called Oort cloud, named after the astronomer who first invented this idea. He figured that there must be a huge cloud of comet nuclei way out in a large sphere-shaped cloud surrounding the solar system. The Oort cloud has three major problems. Number one, it's never been seen. As the late astronomer Carl Sagan wrote, many scientific papers are written each year about the Oort cloud, its properties, its origin, its evolution. Yet there is not yet a shred of direct observational evidence for its existence. Why hasn't anybody ever seen it? Because according to evolutionary models, it's impossible to see it or measure it, because it's too far away. You just have to accept it on faith and believe it exists. Remember that the next time somebody challenges you for believing in creation, because it's religious and not scientific. The evolutionary model actually requires more faith than the creation model. Anyway, that's problem number one with the Oort cloud. Problem number two was just discovered recently. The evolutionary model says that comets originally formed in the TNO region, which is why we're talking about comets now in the TNO part of our tour. But the Oort cloud is supposedly much farther out than that, and surrounds the sun in a huge sphere. How did all the comets get way out there? Evolutionists used to think that the comets migrated out there after they formed, but scientists have now realized this is impossible. It turns out that in the evolutionary model, there would be a lot of collisions along the way, and few comet nuclei would survive the trip. They'd be smashed into powder instead. The Oort cloud, even if it did exist, would have far too few comet nuclei. It couldn't supply the comets that evolutionists need for their billions of years. Problem number three is that many comets couldn't have come from an Oort cloud. These comets are called short-period comets because they orbit the sun in a short period of time, 200 years or less. Short-period comets don't last long. As I mentioned earlier, they can only go around the sun a certain number of times before they're destroyed or leave the solar system completely. A maximum lifespan for a short-period comet has been estimated to be 10,000 years or less. Obviously, if the solar system was really billions of years old, we wouldn't see these comets anymore, unless there was a constant supply of new ones coming in to replace the old. However, a few years ago, evolutionists realized that the Oort cloud couldn't supply them. Short-period comets have certain orbital characteristics that make it impossible for them to have come from an Oort cloud, which is way out there in space. So, most evolutionists today also believe in something called the Kuiper belt. This would be a disk of comet nuclei orbiting out beyond Neptune in the TNO region that we've been talking about. Again, these have been sitting out there quietly for billions of years, but every once in a while, one of them gets disturbed, moves in closer to the sun, and turns into a comet. Therefore, says the evolutionist, it's no problem that we still see short-period comets today. Yes, they only last for a few thousand years once they start orbiting closer to the sun, but there's an endless supply waiting out beyond Neptune to keep replenishing them. Unfortunately for evolution, recent discoveries have shown the Kuiper belt model doesn't work any better than the Oort cloud did. First of all, NASA and other space agencies have been busy in the last few years studying comets. We've actually visited several comets with spacecraft. We sent the Deep Impact spacecraft to crash a probe into a comet called Tempel 1 to see what we could learn about the comet's structure. In an even more amazing feat, the Stardust spacecraft recently visited the Wild 2 comet. The probe actually flew through the comet's tail, collected material from it, and brought it back to Earth. Evolutionists were shocked when they examined this material. Remember, in the evolutionists' story, comets were formed in the outer reaches of the solar system. The evolutionary model says that things that formed way out there must contain certain elements and must not contain certain other elements. Well, we've discovered that comets aren't like this. The volatile materials that evolutionists expected to find in the comet's tail were either rare or non-existent. On the other hand, most of the material was made up of silicates that the evolutionary model says can't have been out there where comets were supposedly born. So in many ways, comets have turned out to be the direct opposite of what the evolutionary model predicted. But there's another problem too. The Hubble Space Telescope was recently used in a massive search for comet nuclei to confirm that they're actually there. The search was the biggest study that anybody had ever done of the TNO region, so far out there in space. Evolutionists expected to find about 85 comet nuclei in the region they searched. How many did they actually find? Only 3. This has massive implications. Even the scientists in charge of the project admitted that this is serious trouble for the overall idea of comet nuclei out there. These results mean that the number of comet nuclei is at least hundreds and possibly even thousands of times less than the number required for supplying short-period comets. The project's report said that the number of nuclei found was, quote, wildly inconsistent, unquote, with what evolutionists had expected. This means that evolutionists have no source for short-period comets. Therefore, they can't explain how we still see comets today after billions of years, even though these comets burn up after only thousands of years. Maybe it's because the solar system isn't really billions of years old. Here's what you aren't being told about comets and TNOs. The TNOs we see look young, not old. The comet material that we've sampled contradicts the evolutionary model. And comets shouldn't be here anymore if the solar system were really billions of years old. Comets are not only among the most beautiful objects in astronomy, they also reveal the utter bankruptcy of evolutionary models. In this video, you've seen how the planets, moons, and other objects in our solar system have falsified evolution over and over again. Some evolutionists will even admit this is true. One astrophysics textbook talks about the solar nebula model and then says this: "We have seen that we know very little about the development of the solar system." Another evolutionary astronomer said this: "To sum up, I think that all suggested accounts of the origin of the solar system are subject to serious objections. The conclusion in the present state of the subject would be that the system cannot exist. This is the best that evolutionary theory can come up with. Our solar system cannot exist. So the next time you hear about some amazing new discovery that confirms evolution again, remember what you've learned in this video. Remember that you're never told the entire story about these models. Remember that they tell you that they have it all figured out, when in reality, the system cannot exist. The more we learn about our solar system, the more we realize how bankrupt evolutionary theory is. On the other hand, the Bible has stood firm the entire time. The more we learn about astronomy, the more we wonder at the beauty and majesty of God's creation. Of course, we learn more about space all the time. Not only that, evolutionists are always changing their models. So I've set up a special website to track the latest information on creation evidences in astronomy. It's at www.creationastronomy.com. As we conclude, you might be wondering about something. In this video, we've discussed the planets and moons in our solar system. But what about our Sun? Or the other stars in our galaxy? Or the Milky Way galaxy itself? Or the billions of other objects that we see in space? Can evolution explain any of these objects? No, it can't. We've discovered that they falsify evolution just as much as the planets and moons of our solar system do. But we'll save all of that for Volume 2 in this video series. Until then, I hope you've enjoyed our tour of the solar system, and remember that truly, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows His handiwork. Thank you.